Okay. All right. I don't think I have any viewers yet. No, so, all right, Jared Perry. I will do sound check. If it sounds okay. All right. There we go. Okay. All right. Well, it appears I have three viewers. I'm not sure. That's okay. That looks right. All right. So, okay. And we have representative from New York, and looks like American South in the chat now. All right, so I don't get to do these things regularly on a basic schedule because my schedule keeps changing every week, um, which is not my preference, but better than nothing. Uh, so I have, uh, in addition to my day job, which is really at night, I work an extended swing shift, I guess you would call it. Uh, a few projects. So I have to edit a book chapter that's from a seminar last November that was fairly international. Representatives from the United States, Germany, Austria, Argentina, and Brazil. I'm not sure if there were some others there or not. But at any rate, I have to edit that written version chapter for the book, the collection that will come out. And my contribution is on ethnic Germans deported from the western parts of the Soviet Union into Kazakhstan in 1941. Much of the rest of the book deals with Russian German diasporas in other regions of the world, particularly the Americas, US, Argentina, and Brazil, where they have large populations that came in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So, and I also have to do a book review for a Russian review on The Blood of Others, which is here. Oh, this is the book. I'm about halfway through. It's not very long. As I said, I had a problem with it because doesn't deal with the history per se. It deals with poetry trying to represent the history. So there's a lot of literary analysis, and I will be honest, poetry written in Russian is much, much more difficult to read than prose written in Russian, particularly the stuff you find in Soviet government archives or that is written by academic historians in Russia and other former Soviet states in the Russian language. So, for instance, this book is from Uzbekistan, but it's written by an ethnic Korean, so his main language, of course, is Russian, and the main language for scholarship in Uzbekistan is still Russian. This is quite easy to read. This is Historiografia Koreitsev Centralnoy Asia. We also know it's very thick, so one of the reasons that it's easy to read simply is They're not asking each word to have a lot of meaning and symbolism the way they do in poetry, right? So a poem is very short. And that's 2/3 of nonfiction I'm currently reading. I found this book on the street. It was free for me, but it says $6.99 on it. The Blood Telegram, which is a great name, but despite being about the massacres in East Pakistan in 1971, blood refers to the name of the U.S. Consul General in Dhaka at the time. So this book is written by Gary J. Bass, but it's based upon the U.S. archives for diplomatic service, particularly under Consul General Blood in Dhaka. I think he was Consul General. At any rate, Weber was head of the U.S. diplomatic facility in East Pakistan before Bangladesh got independence. Name was Blood. So that is it for the nonfiction there. Everything else is basically much more lighter. You might have Kissinger, along with Nixon, was a strong supporter of the government of Pakistan. Both Kissinger and Nixon did not like the government of Indira Gandhi. They did not like the Indian state or Indian people, really. Much closer to the Pakistani military. But also Pakistan was the country that gave the opening to China by Kissinger and Nixon support. So Kissinger, dressed in a burqa and flew from Pakistan into China. The initial meetings between Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai on the Chinese side and Kissinger and Nixon on the U.S. side were arranged by the Pakistani government. The U.S. viewed Pakistan as kind of a strategic asset, giving it depth to support Iran in the Gulf, in the Middle East, but also to have kind of a listening post there close to Soviet Central Asia, along with, of course, what we had in Iran before the overthrow of the second Shah Pahlavi in 1979. So the U.S. Definitely considered Pakistan to be its major ally and client state in South Asia. India had a very close political and military relations with the USSR, despite not being a socialist state or even a state of socialist orientation, as the Soviet government would say, but rather technically a parliamentary democracy. So structurally, I suppose internally India is more similar to Great Britain than it was to the USSR. And of course, Pakistan, much easier to deal with in the government-to-government relations, because it was basically a military junta, but one with a very strong central figure at this time in the form of Yahya Khan, yeah. So Yahya Khan, I believe, was the dictator in 1971. But obviously, when you deal with just the one military dictator in Pakistan, It's much easier than to deal with a huge parliament. Even the Indian government itself, one of the reasons why there's consolidation in the power of the president under Indira Gandhi through the declaration of a state of emergency, is that even she found dealing with the Indian parliament with all its factions, including a number of communist factions that hated each other, to be rather difficult task. All right, so. 1,500 pages is really long for a book, Jared, but so I'm not that far actually into the book on the revolution, war for independence by Bangladesh, and the Operation Searchlight to try and suppress it by the Pakistani army. Although one thing I've noticed is that it is not so much about the events as the U.S. policy regarding the events. All the sources are U.S. sources as far as archives are concerned. All right, so some of the things I'll talk about. So history. I noticed that Michael Tracy's Twitter, lots of people very angry that he said that the bulk of the killings in the Holocaust occurred after the U.S. entry into the war, but I think this is pretty indisputable, despite the mass shootings by the Einsatzgruppen between June and December 1941. Most of the killings took place after December 8th, 1941. And in fact, the first deaths through asphyxiation, carbon monoxide poisoning at Chelmno took place on 8th December 1941. So that's not anything kind of, but he's being attacked viciously as some sort of Holocaust denier for noting that the Operation Reinhardt camps and Auschwitz operated mostly, well, almost entirely in the years 1942 and 43, and for Auschwitz it goes into 44. But Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor were already gone, destroyed by the end of October 1943. But I don't think he's saying that the U.S. is responsible for the Germans. But obviously, there is reactions. I mean, the whole idea of National Socialism, if you read Nolte, going all the way back to the German version of Three Faces of Fascism, and I believe 1963 talks about how National Socialism is a reaction to other events, particularly Bolshevism. But it's not far-fetched to think that the bad course of the war for the Germans after the end of 1941, with the inability to take Moscow and starting to be pushed back after Stalingrad, does have an effect on other policies. So, the fact that the Reinhardt camps and Auschwitz don't come online as extermination centers till 1942, after advance in the East is stopped after the U.S. enters the war, not probably coincidental. It's probably being stepped up because having not been successful in other goals, the National Socialists are going to try and eliminate what they view as the largest internal enemy in the territory, or greatest internal enemy in the territories they occupy. No, Jared, I agree with you, and in the sense of interpretation, I'm a revisionist, but I'm not a negationist because let's just face it. Except for the type of limited negation that you see done largely by Polish scholars in the camp museums themselves, like Madniak and Auschwitz, it's a dead end because it really doesn't matter from the larger argument. The Einsatzgruppen shootings are very well documented from a number of sources. It's only later that we see things are more hidden, particularly the Reinhardt camps, since they don't survive the war in any form the way that Auschwitz does. But certainly the interpretation, historization, contextualization by people like Nolte in the 80s and recently Dirk Moses, who, unlike Nolte, who is definitely a rightist, Moses is an Australian leftist, but he certainly has greatly challenged the standard narrative of the Holocaust as being unique and not connected to larger historical trends. In this case, the ideas of larger colonialism, imperialism, idea first put forth by Fritz Fischer, who was a former National Socialist himself, who then went and became a leftist, that the German war goals in World War II were a continuation of the imperial goals of the Second Reich, Weimar, before Weimar, the Wilhelm II's government. All right. So, Jared, exactly. We need to go to war with Russia because we did the right thing in Vietnam. Yeah, Vietnam seems to have been erased from the collective memory as a touch point for lessons. Let's put it that way. Obviously, I do see, guys in their 70s with the Vietnam veteran shirts and hats around here. But unlike in the 90s, when I was hanging around with the same guys, but they were obviously in their 40s then, there isn't a lot of expression by them that the government sending them to Southeast Asia involved a whole bunch of mistakes leading to ultimately the loss of the war, despite numerous victories on the battlefield against the North Vietnamese and NLF. And obviously a whole lot of loss as far as money sunk into the endeavor and some 58,000 dead Americans in the process. So I think now they're just waiting out their retirement. But obviously the same people 30 years ago, a lot of them were quite outspoken that the government policy from particularly Johnson from 1964 to 1968 was not conducive to U.S. national interest. All right. Well, I was going to talk a little bit about culture. Other thing is blow up on the internet, which I don't want to get too bogged into it because as the Substack piece I linked to today says noted it ultimately is just toxic. But I can't let it stand the idea that white Americans don't have our own culture. That somehow we're just copying Black American culture, and that this is the source of all the problems in Great Britain. So it's some positive things, lots of great American, and by this I'm talking about white Gentiles specifically, not any of the ethnic subgenres, literature and music in the U.S. that is, regardless of some influences from various parts of Europe, and even in some cases outside of Europe, is distinctly American, just belongs distinctly to Americans of European descent. Jalapeno trap. Well, yeah, oh no, I'm not talking about that, but so I know they're kind of a cult around Tolkien. I know he's an accomplished writer. It was never my favorite for reasons of just too long and too much description before any action. But you note that before he came along, there were a number of quite different and successful fantasy writers in the U.S. So, the first major fantasy film made from a major fantasy novel came out before Lord of the Rings was written, and that is The Wizard of Oz. It was the first book in the whole series of books by Frank L. Baum, who was quite right-wing, particularly in his strident defense of the Europeans taking land from Native Americans in Kansas and other what were then considered the West. I mean, obviously, after 1848, there's a whole lot of territory in the West that's not very well settled. The most settled state was here in New Mexico. And the Mexicans, after the Spanish, managed to get the population up to about 60,000. And that included the fairly large Native American populations in the Pueblos, as well as the Navajos and the Apaches. So they didn't get a lot of settlers here, especially when you compare it to later settlement by Anglos, places like Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and of course, ultimately, California. And L. Frank Baum. L. Frank Baum, B-A-U-M. It means tree in German. So it's the German equivalent of maybe orchard, which would be multiple trees, but Baum is a single tree. The Wizard of Oz series is great. Other writers coming before the Second World War in the United States in the kind of fantastic genre. Edgar Rice Burroughs, most famous for Tarzan, but also the John Carter of Mars, and I believe it's Peculiador, takes place on Venus. So my favorite, the John Carter of Mars series, Swords and Planets with strange Martians. But Edgar Rice Burroughs, definitely adventure, pulp, fantasy, a little science fiction there. Some gonzo, what we would later call gonzo stuff, perhaps, in there, but very good writer. And if you have, sons about, I don't know, 11, 12 years old, it's about perfect age to introduce them to the series John Carter of Mars, I believe the first book. And I don't know how many, I believe it's about a dozen books in that series. Also, of course, Robert E. Howard unfortunately killed himself at a very young age, but had a number of fantasy heroes, basically created the swords and sorcery genre. So Conan is the most famous, but also Solomon Kane a little bit earlier, and he also does Kroll. Was a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft, one of the great founders of modern horror, together with Poe, who comes earlier. Definitely a heavily American influenced genre, even when foreigners are writing it, because of those two figures. A lot of people talk about the Horror of Red Hook as being a very racist piece, but I would say the Horror of Red Hook is interesting, and it's one of the two pieces, and it's not the best one, that is a detective story. The other one is Call of Cthulhu with Inspector LaGrassa in New Orleans. But actually, the people that are the main enemy or main villain, the main villain is a Dutchman who's degenerated because he's a degenerate, basically. So he's physically and mentally degenerated from his former status. But the other kind of the cult members around him are Yazidis. Now, the Yazidis are technically Aryan people. They're in Kurdistan. They generally speak Kurdish, but the big difference, of course, is religious. The Yazidi religion is not real well known to outsiders because they don't let outsiders look at any of it. But according to the ulema, that is the Muslim scholars in Kurdistan, the Kurdish Muslims, the Yazidis are Satan worshippers. And at the time, Mesopotamia, under a League of Nations mandate for the British, their information would have come from local Kurds. And of course, anything written by anthropologists at places like the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, founded in 1916, probably would have echoed these opinions, that they would have used the larger Kurdish notable population as their source base. So Lovecraft also notes that the Yazidis coming into New York are Satan worshippers. And this is the background to the Horror of Red Hook. But the Yazidis are physically, anthropologically, I guess, white. They're not Africans. They're not Asians. They're not. So I mean, you look at some of the other stories. Shot Over Innsmouth, which talks about miscegenation. The race involved is not white, South Pacific Islanders. At any rate, Whisper in the Darkness, Shadow Over Innsmouth, Call of Cthulhu, I would say in reverse order. Those are his three best stories for Lovecraft. But he wrote a fair amount despite dying fairly early of stomach cancer. He was younger than I am when he died. Shadow Over Innsmouth is quite good. I certainly like it better than Mountains of Madness. I'm not sure if I like it as well as Whisper in the Dark or Call of Cthulhu, but certainly it's quite good. And it certainly, in terms of its condemnation of miscegenation, its negative depiction of non-whites, is certainly more racist than the Horror of Red Hook by a long shot, but it doesn't seem to get the criticism of the other story. All right. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, that in the period before World War II, particularly the 1920s and 1930s, there's a lot of U.S. fantasy literature, and it is very, very different, much darker, much more individualistic, much less pretentious than the streams that develop in Great Britain with Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. But again, this is because Americans have been separated from Europe, particularly politically, and particularly from the British for a couple of centuries now. So it's no more reasonable to think that we would be the same as them as it is to think that Black Americans would be the same as Black Africans. Now, there's still a lot of similarities, but the historical and cultural developments have been dividing us for a while. Yes, and I believe Wade Manley, this is the Answer Visionary Companion of Folk Occultism himself. Wade Manley does a lot with the kind of folk stories in the Appalachians, particularly in the Northwest Carolina region. And so he actually was born in Angola of American missionary parents, and they returned to the U.S. He fought in Korea and then came back and was a writer in the 50s and 60s. But a lot of local folklore in the Appalachian area, including some Native American tales. Although when you look at it, particularly the way he writes the story, it's obvious that they get filtered through the local white population. That is, there is some Native American influence on the folklore of the white settlers in the region, which is to be expected. So there's another reason why there's such a difference in American literature of this genre from what you find in Europe. Yes. And just one last thing. Visionary Companion, there's definitely a lot. I mean, even in like country western music, right? The song by Charlie Daniels, "The Devil Went Down to Georgia." There's a couple of stories by Wade Manley drawing upon Appalachian folk tales about exactly that type of scenario. The big difference between the song with Charlie Daniels and the original folk tales and the interpretation by Manley is in the original one, it's silver and not gold. The devil can't stand silver. But the thing about the fiddle, the thing about the contest, the thing about gambling, that all had been around in Appalachia as folk tales for quite some time. It wasn't something that Charlie Daniels came up with on his own. All right. So if anybody wants to come on, I can give you the. I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of the Appalachian population are Scots-Irish from Ulster. That they would bring over tales from Northern Ireland into Appalachia is not surprising. All right, but again, there are distinctions, divergences as the time historical development separates white Americans, Euro Americans, right? Americans of European descent from Europeans still in Europe. So I mean, we in some senses we're parallel to people in Australia, descendant of mostly British Islanders. We're more diverse in having a lot of Germans and Scandinavians, particularly in the Midwest, as well as some Dutch, but also the Afrikaners, who are mostly Dutch, some French Huguenot, a little bit of German, in these kind of European settler states that split off politically, but also culturally from Europe. I am not an expert on the technical points of music, cyberpunk internal affairs. There obviously is, in a number of genres of American music, a black influence. Certainly, music that black people play and listen to, and regardless of whether you like it or not, is not entirely copied from Europeans, right? Although there is European influence in it. How much African influence there is on predominantly white forms of music, that is, music played and written and listened to mostly by people of European ancestry in the United States, is hard to gauge. But certainly, I mean, some of it, the early rock and roll has some influence. Others has less influence. I'm not sure how to chop this up. Other than that, right? It's obvious that like rap is black music and country western is white music, although you can find a few black country western singers and songwriters, but they're writing and singing in a white style. So it's you're pointing to exception at this point. But I think it is pretty clear in the American context, right, that there are two separate cultures regarding white people and black people, and we pretty much know what belongs to which culture, right? So, country western music, white music, rap, black music, and you can make whatever judgment you want on quality or talent or whatnot, but I don't think it's really an issue, right, to say that it's all just one. That all the white people in America, we just listen to rap and Lizzo and other black musicians. That's generally not true. Cyberpunk Internal Affairs, again, you're getting into technical details. I can't really answer. I'm just answering at a general cultural level. And I think it's obvious to anybody who lives in the United States and who has listened to music produced in the United States that there's a clear difference between white music and black music. And yeah, there's cross influences, probably more white influence on black music than vice versa, right? But I mean, pointing out that somebody like Elvis has some African influences doesn't negate the existence of white music in the United States. It's a silly argument. So I mean, my point, I don't want to belabor this because to me, I think it's not real productive to go down negative, right? But I think it is obvious that there is a white American culture, even if white ethnic self-identification is still not fully formed because there hasn't been a complete merger in self-consciousness between people of German and English and Irish and Italian and Polish and other European ancestries, right? It's pretty clear, though, that the culture produced in the United States since the 17th century by various Europeans, right? That it's distinctly white American and not black. And it's also not European, that it diverges from what exists in the European continent and on the British Isles. So you don't have anybody, despite his huge Anglophilia, like Lovecraft, anywhere in England, anywhere in Scotland, anywhere in Wales. You have the closest you might have is Bram Stoker, who was a Protestant from Ireland. But even there is a huge, huge gap. Quid veritas, it's not anything new. The Iranians have been denouncing us Americans as the great Satan for many decades now. They just added one more Ayatollah. Okay. Someday I'm going to have somebody who knows more about music than me on to discuss some things. I will probably try and have Philip Daniels on to discuss Alfred Schnitzka, the famous composer of classical and electronic music in the Soviet Union, whose mother was Volga German and his father was a German-speaking Jewish immigrant, which is important in that they avoided deportation to Kazakhstan or Siberia in 1941. but because of my schedule, it's going to be a while before I can arrange discussion with that. But I don't know a lot technically about music, but so I'm like Kevin Michael Grace on a lower scale because he obviously has a greater cultural knowledge of it. But I can talk about its influence culturally and its role in society. But as far as the technical details of how it's made or what exactly influences particular types of sounds, I have no background or training. I don't. I'm not a musician myself. I'm just a fan, right? So, but again, it's obvious to me that somebody like Hank Williams, that's white music, right? I don't, and if people, and it's white American music, and if people don't in Europe don't like it, I don't care. If Black Americans don't like it, I don't care. All I want is it to be a recognition that obviously Hank Williams' music is neither Black nor European. Yeah, Jolly Scholar is very good, Visionary Companion. I may have him on again. He did a very good series on Pete Seeger, who was a communist. All right, so and the only reason I bring this up is because this is popular music was one of the things that was brought up, particularly with Lizzo. But I don't think this is even. I mean, if you go back even 40 years ago, 1980s, commercial pop music, they were promoting a thin, white, blonde-haired women, and some of them are still pretty good looking, like Terry Nunn. Deborah Harry is not as good looking as she was back then, but right, this is a totally different phenotype and somatic type being promoted back when I was a teenager and acutely aware of these things since it was obvious, it had been obvious for a while, that one of the ways that it promoted the sales obviously was kind of just the sexual fantasy of these women. I'm not sure what went wrong with going from Terry Nunn to Lizzo, but perhaps taste in erotic fantasies have radically changed among young men in the last 40s. Yeah, Debbie Harry was fantastically good looking in the 1980s. Well, my point was that Terry Nunn, as old as she is now, is still pretty good looking. Debbie Harry is not aged as well. All right, so I'm going to invite people on. And I don't have too much more to say, rambling on, since this is kind of unscripted. I went to walk to the Pecos River today. It's a nice day. It's not too far from my house, and did a little reading, had some lunch, and Quintus Veritas, you're probably right about that. Again, I'm just stating the facts that Terry Nunn still looks quite good today. Of all of the sex symbols of the pop music in the 80s, I think she's the best looking one today. Although she was certainly a stunner in the 80s. You look at videos that Berlin did back in the 80s. I mean, maybe it's a matter of taste. To me, she was every bit as good looking as Debbie Harry. And of course, some similarities. The blonde hair, the light figure, the white skin. Certainly not a Lizzo type, though. All right, so I'm going to put up the link. I'll put up where you can get the link. Let's put it that way. So invite people. And okay, so Susanna Hoffs. Susanna Hoffs was the lead singer of the Go-Go's, right? Hoffs Jewish? The name just sounds generic German to me. I wouldn't put that as a Jewish name, but I don't know. The Bengals? All right, well, let me just, you can, easiest for me has always been email because I'm an old guy, but Twitter DM also works. Uh, Susanna Hoffs, the Bengals, early life. Yes, it says she was Jewish. Okay, did not know that. Was not paying attention. Um, I'm not sure it matters in this particular case. She's 63. The picture from her here from 2006. So she looked good in that picture. At any rate, if you want to come on, you send me an email or a DM. I'll send you the link. We discuss anything you want: music, history, literature. But I will say the mad Ayatollah has kind of forced me to embrace white American culture more closely in the last couple of days than I have in decades. And it is really because even when an educated black nationalist says white Americans have no culture, you know he's being silly and stupid. But when the British start doing it, you know there's something nefarious up. That this is more than just a stupid insult that can be brushed off. This is some sort of blood libel. So, easiest email, but I'll take the DM if you want to come on. And again, one of the things here, I don't have lots of knowledge about lots of things. So, for technical issues over musical production, I'm totally lost. Uh, yes, you'll see already, Visionary Companion. I don't know the origin of syncopatation or improvisation. It does seem likely to me that they existed in European forms of music before African slaves were brought over to North America. But I don't I don't have a deep background on the technical influences of individual music, but I don't think it really matters for the debate, right? Unless you're an idiot, you're not going to claim that Hank Williams is black music, or that it is music even listened to by a lot of black people. I'm sure you can find one or two, but in the general, not. Now, you don't have to like Hank Williams, but he is white American music. Blank Williams. So am I not going to get anybody coming on? As long as we can refute that our music culture originated from African Americans. Well, I mean, there are, as I said, some forms of white American music that have some, obviously, it's not the majority, influence from non European sources, but again, country western music, American folk music, bluegrass, these are white forms of music that are unique to Americans of European ancestry. Right? So, I mean, this is just a matter of noticing differences. It's not even a matter of saying one is better than the other. The reason I embrace it, and the reason I'm encouraging other people who are of European descent that are U.S. citizens to embrace it, is because it's our music, right? So, I mean, if you want to make an argument that's not as good as, European composers, particularly, of course, the Germans are well noted, that's fine. But the reason people embrace their country and their culture is not because it's necessarily better, it's because it's theirs. No, obviously it's not. Obviously, Lizzo is not the culture of white Americans. I don't even know if it's the culture of Black Americans. Certainly, I say Black Americans are a distinct and separate nation with a distinct and separate culture from white Americans. But as far as I can tell, musically, the forms that most Black Americans are listening to, particularly if we want to go back any time before the recent years, they're not Lizzo. I'm not a big fan of rap or hip hop, but I don't think Lizzo has the type of fan base among Black Americans that somebody like Tupac Shakur or Ice Cube or Biggie Smalls or any of the other rap artists has. The source of the origin really isn't relevant. Cyberpunk internal affair. My point is that at this point, right, there is a distinct white American culture. It is diverged in a number of ways from the cultures of Europe in the last several centuries. And it has always been distinct, despite some cross-pollination from that of the non-white groups in the U.S. That is, it's obvious, and it's been obvious for quite some time, right, that there are genres of music that are black, and there are genres of music that are white. They even like have whole different radio stations, right? If the format rhythm and blues, i.e., black music, or is it classic rock, i.e., a type of white music, which some parts of it may have some African influence early on, but it's predominantly white, particularly in its audience and its appeal to its audience. I would say you're right, Quid es Veritas. I mean, Tupac Shakur's mother was in the Black Panthers, and actually was involved in a court case due to FBI infiltration of her particular branch of the Panthers. But obviously, he had a large following among Black Americans. Not that there are no white Americans that listen to him, but obviously we talk about Tupac Shakur as an artist, regardless of what you think of the quality of his art. Right? Clearly, he is a black artist singing in a black genre, or talking or rapping, however you wish to describe it, in a black genre, right? And we could take somebody else. I view Tank Williams because I think he's kind of archetypical. But we could take Johnny Cash, who I think is actually a better musician. These are typically white musicians. These are white. This is white music, right? The form is white. The themes are white. The appeal to the audience is white, right? And so while there's not a perfect division, right? Obviously, even people that are consciously aware, they don't like only listen to musicians of one color, right? But that doesn't. Right? If I listen to John Coltrane, I'm aware that I'm listening to black music. I'm not making I'm not going to try and claim that it's some sort of greater American music that doesn't see color. Yeah, send me money. No, cyberpunk is no fit. Obviously, there are some black musicians that are talented. There's some black music that I like. Not all of it black American. There's some black African music I like. But again, this isn't about quality. You can make those arguments separately. This is about just the distinction that there are certain culture. Well, there are certain ethno-cultural groups have their own cultural production that is different. And unless you're going to be one of these colorblind boomers that denies that there are national and ethnic and cultural and built on strong differences between white and black Americans that exist, as well as differences in skin color. And I've never met a black person that denies this. Right? It's only the white liberal boomer that claims that we're all exactly the same. Then you have to make categories, right? And this was something that was not controversial until very recently. Right? So you had openly black radio formats and openly white radio formats for decades. Prince, I'm not a huge Prince fan. I know people in Minneapolis that are, right? But at the time Prince was writing in Minneapolis, it still had quite small black population compared to what it has today. We're talking 40 years ago. And financially in that situation, going to have to appeal to a white audience. Also, some unusual things. He was a Jehovah's Witness. I know it has a number of black adherents, but I'm not sure we really consider it a black religion. Prince is one of those people where the objective subjective comes in for me, because objectively I recognize that he was a talented musician. Subjectively, I just don't like his music. and yes, 40 years ago, the black population in Minneapolis was much, much smaller than it is today. And also different. It didn't have the Somalis, right? So the black population in Minneapolis were black Americans 40 years ago. Now there's some black Americans, but there's also a lot of Somalis, some Ethiopians, some Eritreans, right? People that are culturally distinct also from the earlier black settlements. Only song I can think about Human League is "Don't You Want Me." All right, the Somalis are Hamitic, but we're getting into, like, fine cutting here. Hope I don't choke to death here. Now, this is why it's hard for me to do a stream on my own. My throat dries out. Yeah, I mean, obviously, Somalis and Ethiopians and Eritreans are not Bantu. They're in Eastern Africa, which is Semitic, which is influenced by Arabs and Semites from to the east. But for purposes in the U.S., I would say that they are black, but they are culturally distinct from the blacks descended from West African slaves. Otherwise, then we have to put another category in the census. You're going to put East African, Hamitic. But the point, of course, obviously, is that despite the similarities in appearance, their culture is very different than people from West Africa to begin with, but obviously American descendants of West African slaves. So you have both the original differences between East and West Africa, and then the divergence historically. So, all right. Well, I'm going to wrap it up soon. If I don't get any emails or DMs, because my throat is difficult to talk by myself here uh, without anybody to bounce off ideas and carry the part of the weight, water, whatever you want to call it. All right. So I will add. I don't want to be too blackpilling, but the big thing I noticed on inflation at work this week is the price of eggs has gone way up. So eggs are a pretty basic form of protein. The chicken had been going up, but obviously this was for the meat of the chicken. And now the eggs have become expensive. So I don't want to blackpill anybody, but the white eggs are the ones that went up in price. So brown eggs are still lower in price by a considerable margin. Well, that may be an option. I noticed a lot of people have switched from buying white eggs to brown eggs recently at work. Uh, One of those life hacks. They actually don't taste any different. It just it's just an aesthetic preference, really. I think so. Uh, but I'm not sure how much longer the price of brown eggs will remain without going up either. All right. So you can still buy brown eggs if you like eggs. I'd buy them now before they go up. All right. If nobody's going to get on, I'm going to log out and encourage everybody to read American literature, listen to American music. And by that, I'm talking about white American music and literature. But the point is that we are neither part of a. There isn't any pan American music in the U.S. that encompasses all ethnic and racial groups, right? The white music and black music uh, and other aspects of culture split and divided from the very beginning. All right, I'll see everybody later. Get out of here and go for another walk.